How to run a 3-day per week split. This is actually an extension of a question that came in through Patreon. Brian wanted to know what the best way to implement an upper, lower approach onto a 3-day per week template was. So the upper lower approach is very common. There's a few ways to do it. If you're going to run the typical bench squat overhead deadlift approach, it tends to be pretty convenient because you get enough recovery from the main lifts. You can go really hard on them and you get a full week in most cases to recover. But because like overhead and bench and squat and deadlift share some muscle groups, those muscle groups will get hit more frequently than once per week. So it's a good mix of elevated training stress in terms of frequency, but also enough recovery from the main lifts. And then the variations that are pretty common is like a 2-lift emphasis. If you want to emphasize, let's say bench squat, and on one of those days you might do shoulder and deadlift work as kind of a secondary movement, as kind of an afterthought. Or you can do a blended approach. If you really want to up the frequency and give some lip service to the main movements more frequently than once per week, that's also viable. Now, when you're trying to choose a split, the most important thing is going to be what you can actually commit to. If you can commit to 6 or 7 days per week, that's great. That gives you a ton of options. But many of you can only do 4 days, 3 days, or even less. And if that's the case, then that does a lot of problem solving for you. That takes away most of the options that you have. So the next step is going to make itself pretty obvious pretty quick. So for a 3-day per week approach, the basic options, and this is what Brian had a question about, the basic options are to do an upper, lower, and then a blended day inside of a week. So you preserve the 7-day work week and you're just kind of cramming the work in on that 3rd day, or to do an upper lower split that bleeds into the next week. And I've actually written about this. I call it a 4 and 9. I'm not the only one to do this. I think Swede prescribes it in 5th set. It's something that a lot of, especially advanced powerlifters, are inclined to do, where you'll see that they will only have their heavy day on certain main lifts every 10 days, 14 days, sometimes longer, and they'll populate the interim, the time in between with lighter work or skill work or accessory work. Also, the other common options are a push-pull legs or a whole body split. Now, push-pull legs doesn't look that different than this option. If you're going to say bench press, do upper back work, and then do your squatting and deadlifting, that kind of works out the same. Another twist on that is to bench, do your deadlift and upper back work, and then do squatting and leg dominant stuff there. That's an option. Whole body, you're gonna be looking at something like what Mike T does, where you're doing some type of squat, bench, dead every day, and it's on a DUP style split. Andy Baker does it with heavy, light, medium, or even the popular linear progressions, Gray Skull, Texas method, starting strength, stuff like that. You're squatting 2 to 3 times per week, pressing every session. So that's also viable. I don't write about that too often because I'm not a huge fan of high frequency unless you are brand new, unless you're in that novice territory, because that gives you just a huge margin for error. After you get stronger, you get more advanced, you lose that margin. Now that's fine if you've trained like that your whole life, you've had time to kind of pivot and tweak and figure out how to make it work. But for those who haven't, you really have to commit to that learning curve, and it's not obvious. You really have to have a death grip on the rate of progression, which days are going to be like your heavy overloaded progression days, which days are going to be lighter days or back off or speed or recovery work. So a lot more goes into that. I see it as unnecessary complexity, but that's just me. That's not to say it can't work, just means that there's some pitfalls you have to be aware of. So I really like the upper lower approach just because it is versatile. You can make it work a lot of different ways, and this is a perfect example of this. So comparing option 1 and option 2, it really comes down to what the length of the work week is, or the microcycle. There are some benefits to having a long microcycle that some people don't consider. Most people are really locked into the idea that you have to be on a 7-day work week. That's really only the case because it's convenient from like a logistics and planning standpoint. There's nothing really magical about it. In fact, committing to the 7-day week is what leads to a lot of the things you see in training that had to be implemented to make that sustainable. So things like deloading every 3rd week. That's a byproduct of fatigue catching up because you're forcing your work in on this 7-day recovery period. So moving to a 9 or 10-day week can put off the amount of time until you need to deload or until you need to take a step back. You're getting more recovery in the work week, which means fatigue isn't going to accumulate so fast. You're also going to notice that sticky movements that you have a hard time predicting performance with, are going to be better suited here. So if you're, let's say, not very mechanically advantaged to a movement, each touch is going to take more out of you. You might find that you have a hard time predicting how you're going to do. So you long arm benchers, or maybe you short arm deadlifters. I know I have a hard time with my deadlift. Doing a 9 or 10 day split in the past yielded just fantastic returns. I was able to go harder on deadlift days and not worry about shitting the bed 7 days later when I came back. I was fresher, I performed more predictably. So that is a very strong case for that. Now, if you're going to do this one, I strongly recommend you do not do this kind of simple one lift per day per week approach, because you're going to have just way too much time in between. You do want a little more frequency than that, unless you're a very, very advanced lifter or someone who falls into like fast gainer territory where you are justified in taking the time off because you don't detrain that fast. People who are not fast gainers, mere mortals, most natty lifters are going to need a bit more frequency with their touches. So I strongly recommend doing a 2-lift emphasis where you hit, say, squatting and benching twice in that 9 to 10 day period. One would be, let's say, a heavier day or a more intensity-based day. The other would be either volume, or it would be a different movement, or it would be reduced intensity so that it's sustainable, something like a recovery day. Or a blended approach, applying that exact same principle. That's going to give you the frequency you need, but you're still only going to have one really big, heavy day in that 9 to 10 day period. So you're going to recover a lot better. So that's kind of the key here. With the 9 to 10 day break, you want to exploit that. So I do recommend focusing on 2 lifts, but also having one day where you do get heavy, where you do strain yourself, because you can really take advantage of that extended recovery time. Now with this approach, you're going to prioritize days 1 and 2. Your full upper and lower body days are going to give you a lot more time to focus on those particular movements, so you can do more exercises, more sets. You can take longer in between sets, which means you can go heavier. So these are going to be your bread and butter. Day 3 is where the work is kind of getting smushed. So you don't have the ability to spend as much time on one exercise. You don't have the ability to really tear yourself down with a bunch of accessory movements. So to get the most bang out of your buck, you're going to want to look at that as more of a recovery day, or if you do speed work, or if you do density work, anything where the load's going to be a bit lighter and you can move faster. Again, that lighter second day is also going to make the heavy stuff here more sustainable. And then because you are doing this every 7 days, you're going to have to abide by typical recovery protocols. So either going in a wave where you build up over so many weeks and then drop back and repeat, or if you're doing some type of block training where you're in kind of the same threshold, you're hitting the gas each workout, and then week 3, week 4, maybe week 5, you take a full deload to let yourself clear out. So again, making it sustainable. So this is how I would approach these 2 methods. I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. I think this approach works better when you have fewer things to worry about. So let's say if you're a strongman, you're just worried about overhead and deadlift, squatting, benching, those are accessories. Maybe you still do them, but they're kind of an afterthought. That's really convenient because you can put them together. You don't have to worry about expending peak amounts of energy to get those lifts up. If you are a power lifter, if you're specifically focused on squatting, benching, deadlifting, specifically for meet preparation, then I really do think you need the 9 to 10 day split, because you can do 2 bench days in that time, which is going to be appropriate for most. And you can have a squat day and a deadlift day where you can go really hard, give yourself all that time to recover. You can still focus on weak areas twice in that time. Let's say your hammies are weak, you can do hamstring work on squat and deadlift day. So you get that extra frequency. But you really are going to benefit from those squatting and deadlifting sessions being really far apart, so they get kind of equal attention. So I would bias towards that, but they can certainly both work. Now, most of you are not going to fall cleanly into one category or another. Most of you are going to have varied goals that maybe overlap between different competitive arenas, and that's perfectly okay. You just have to write down on paper, have a clear conceptual understanding of what your main priority is. Are you in a basic developmental phase? You're just trying to get some even growth over your whole body to set yourself up for strength-specific work down the road? Are you in that strength-specific phase? Are there particular lifts that you are more focused on getting mileage out of than others. You just have to be aware of that. What is important to you and what phase of training are you in right now? And once you write that out, it becomes a lot clearer as to which path is going to be the one you're best suited running. And guys, if you do have questions, if you have ideas for videos, if you just want some insight into how I train and you want to look over my training footage, all of that is on Patreon. It's the easiest way to get in contact with me, and that is where I pull most of my video ideas from. It's $5 a month, and for the access you get and the information that's there, you're really not going to find a better deal. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.